Two numbers collide and most headlines fail to explain either of them clearly or honestly. A country described through sanctions in Sécurité. And isolation is simultaneously accelerating construction, lowering internal costs and locking critical systems together in ways rarely seen under pressure. What does this shift actually mean for you when Ibrahim Traoré moves away from speeches and instead engineers change through roads? Digital visibility, logistics, and energy reliability? Because what unfolded next was not symbolic progress, but a direction that quietly forces every observer to reconsider what power and preparation really look like. You are about to hear an account that matters because it explains mechanisms most coverage avoids. It focuses on outcomes, sequencing, and constraints rather than slogans or personalities. The payoff is clarity about what is changing and why the pace suddenly feels different. This is not commentary for casual listening or partisan reassurance. If you stop early, it is easy to misread preparation as chaos and mistakes islands for absence. That error leads to shallow conclusions and missed signals that shape costs, access, and leverage. Staying with the full sequence shows how choices compound and why reversals become expensive. It also clarifies where risks remain, which trade-off persist, and what constraints still bind. You will see how Ibrahim Traoré fits into this arc without myth-making or dismissal. Skipping ahead costs understanding at the exact moment context becomes most valuable. The choice is simple: follow the evidence step by step, or keep guessing from fragments. The stakes are intellectual accuracy and practical foresight, not agreement or applause. That difference determines whether decisions feel sudden later or intelligible now. Understanding first prevents surprise when consequences arrive. Something important has been happening beneath the noise, and it contradicts the dominant narrative. While most coverage focused on instability and diplomatic pressure, the underlying machinery of the state was being rebuilt in a deliberate sequence. By late 2025 moving into 2026, this shift became visible on the ground, not as a single showcase, but as a coordinated push across transport, digital systems, logistics, and energy. All at once. The scale matters because it breaks a common pattern. In many countries under pressure, development fragments into isolated projects that never reinforce each other. Here, the order was intentional, and the logic was structural rather than symbolic. Movement inside the country was treated as a first constraint, not an afterthought. Unreliable transport had quietly inflated prices, increased risk, and slowed every sector without dramatic headlines. Addressing that constraint first changed how the economy could behave even before other reforms appeared. From there, the problem of visibility surfaced. Large parts of the population and many markets remained invisible to modern systems even when roads improved. This invisibility limited participation, weakened planning, and preserved inefficiencies that infrastructure alone could not solve. Digital inclusion, therefore, was not framed as convenience, but as economic and administrative power. Once connectivity expanded, behavior shifted rapidly, and coordination costs fell across sectors that previously operated in isolation. Rail followed as a cost correction. For a landlocked country, dependence on road transport quietly taxes every ton of goods moved. Lowering logistics costs was less about speed and more about predictability and scale. Industries that were previously marginal began to look viable once transport stopped consuming their margins. Energy came last for a reason. Nothing holds if power fails, and past instability had taught that lesson repeatedly. By pairing generation with storage and maintaining baseload stability, planners reduced one of the most politically sensitive failure points in daily life. This sequence reveals intent. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the emphasis was not on announcing ambition, but on removing bottlenecks one by one so progress could compound instead of stall. The immediate effects were subtle, but the direction was clear and difficult to reverse. At this stage, the story gains a guide not as a hero, but as a reference point for how decisions were interpreted. Observers inside and outside the country began to notice that the sequence was not accidental, even if it was rarely discussed openly. What stood out was not a single announcement, but the consistency of choices made under constraint. Early assessments from regional planners and logistics operators offered the first confirmation. They were not reacting to speeches or diplomatic signals, but to changes they could measure in time. Cost and reliability. Routes that were once unpredictable became schedulable, and that alone altered how risk was calculated. Warehouses, depots, and service hubs started to appear along corridors because assumptions had shifted quietly, not because incentives were loudly advertised. A second confirmation came from administrative practice. As digital coverage expanded, coordination between agencies improved without expanding bureaucracy. Decisions that once relied on estimates began to rely on data. And delays that were once tolerated became visible and harder to justify. This did not eliminate friction, but it changed how quickly problems surfaced and how they were addressed. These signals converged around a single reading. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the leadership was acting less like a government seeking validation and more like a system builder prioritizing durability. That posture reduced short-term applause but increased long-term coherence. It also meant that reversals would carry higher costs than continuation. A detail oft unmissed in surface analysis. From that moment, the question was no longer whether something was happening, but whether it was already too embedded to ignore. It began with a narrow decision that looked technical and unremarkable. Movement inside the country was slow, risky, and expensive. And that friction touched everything else. Once the first corridors were prioritized, delays shortened, accidents fell, and schedules stopped drifting. Costs that had been absorbed quietly by farmers, traders, and consumers began to compress. The trigger was not a speech, but a shift in how time and distance were treated as economic variables. Then pressure built quickly. As routes stabilized, activity clustered along them. Logistics firms adjusted plans. Businesses recalculated delivery windows. Land values along corridors started to move. What had been fragmented markets began to behave as a single system, and the pace of change accelerated without formal announcements. The escalation followed a pattern. Faster movement exposed a second constraint. Information lagged behind goods. Payments stalled even when trucks arrived on time. Administrative processes still consumed days where minutes were possible. That mismatch created new bottlenecks almost immediately. And the response came fast. Coverage expanded into areas long treated as marginal. Connectivity erased blind spots that had hidden producers, consumers, and entire communities from planning. Once visibility improved, behavior shifted. Prices were checked in real time. Transactions moved digitally. Coordination costs fell across sectors that had operated in isolation. The climb was steep because the release of pent-up demand rarely waits for permission. The third phase compounded the pressure. Roads and data lowered friction, but bulk costs remained high. Heavy goods still moved inefficiently. Margins were thin. Scale was limited. Rail rehabilitation changed that equation. Volumes increased. Schedules stabilized. Fuel use per unit dropped. Industries that had hovered at the edge of viability crossed into planning mode. What looked like transport policy functioned as industrial policy without labels. Aftershocks followed. Maintenance capacity was rebuilt locally. Skills accumulated where contractors had once rotated out. Investors' length and horizons because logistics stopped consuming uncertainty premiums. Trade routes that had decayed quietly reactivated, pulling the system outward toward regional flows. The country's landlocked position began to feel less like a penalty and more like a designed constraint being managed. Energy pressure arrived last, and it was decisive. As demand rose, reliability became non-negotiable. Intermittency had punished households and businesses before, and tolerance was thin. Generation paired with storage changed the risk profile. Baseload stability reduced outages. Hospitals, schools, telecom towers, and small enterprises gained predictability. Trust accumulated not through messaging, but through fewer interruptions in daily life. Each move amplified the next. Movement lowered costs. Visibility improved coordination. Rail cut structural expenses. Power stabilized everything else. By the time the sequence was visible to outsiders, incentives had already shifted internally. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the timeline did not read like a campaign calendar. It read like a checklist of pressure points being removed in order of consequence. That is why the aftershocks mattered more than the triggers. Systems, once locked together, resist reversal. Debate can slow narratives, but infrastructure keeps operating. And when operations continue, expectations adjust faster than commentary can catch up. This is the point where intuition needs to give way to measurement. Up to now, the pattern can sound directional, even persuasive, without feeling fully grounded. So it is necessary to slow down briefly and look at the weight of the changes through numbers that describe scale, speed, and human impact rather than ambition. The first anchor is scale. By the time the infrastructure sequence became visible, more than 30 large projects were being executed in parallel across transport, digital networks, rail, and energy. That matters because dispersion at this level reduces single-point failure and signals system design rather than headline chasing. In practical terms, it means progress in one area was not waiting on completion in another, lowering the risk of stalled capacity. The second anchor is speed. In the digital layer alone, over 750 previously unconnected communities were targeted for full coverage within a single rollout window. That pace is significant because telecom expansion normally follows demand slowly, prioritizing dense and profitable areas first. Here, coverage moved ahead of profit logic, which compressed the timeline for participation and visibility rather than stretching it over years. The third anchor concerns capital intensity. More than $19 million were committed to digital inclusion alongside local data processing capacity. This was not symbolic funding. It supported towers in low-density areas, fiber extensions beyond urban cores, and domestic routing that reduced reliance on external systems. The effect was lower latency, higher resilience, and faster service delivery without expanding administrative headcount. Rail provides another scale reference. A $53 million rehabilitation and expansion program targeted strategic corridors rather than cosmetic reach. Cost per ton moved dropped sharply compared to road transport, which matters because logistics costs compound across every sector. Lower per unit transport expense translated directly into thinner inflation pressure and wider viability margins for industry. Energy numbers carry the most immediate human signal. A 150 megawatt solar installation paired with 50 megawatts of battery storage changed how intermittency was experienced. This pairing mattered because generation without storage does not guarantee reliability. Alongside it, roughly 25 additional megawatts were added near the capital to reduce transmission loss and stabilize demand centers. Baseload stability was reinforced with a 119 megawatt plant under long-term agreement. This number is not impressive because of size alone, but because of timing. It ensured that hospitals, schools, data centers, and transport systems did not face outages during transition periods. Reliability reduced political pressure in everyday life without a single speech. Taken together, these figures describe something specific. Costs fell where they used to hide. Time compressed where it used to drift. Visibility expanded where planning had relied on guesswork. For households, that meant fewer outages and less lost time. For businesses, it meant predictable schedules and planning horizons beyond survival. For the state, it meant delivery without constant crisis management. The numbers do not describe perfection. They describe direction with mass behind it. And once mass starts moving, stopping it requires more than argument. It is important to acknowledge that serious objections exist, and some of them are reasonable. One argument holds that infrastructure alone cannot compensate for security risks, sanctions, and political uncertainty. From this view, roads, networks, and power plants may improve efficiency, but they do not resolve instability that deters investment and strains public trust. Supporters of this position argue that without parallel political normalization, gains remain fragile and exposed to reversal. That concern deserves a careful response. Security and politics do shape outcomes, But infrastructure changes the baseline from which those pressures operate. When movement is predictable, information is visible, and energy is stable, the cost of disruption rises for everyone involved. Instability does not disappear, but its leverage weakens because daily life and economic activity are less easily paralyzed. In other words, infrastructure does not solve security, yet it narrows the space in which insecurity can dominate behavior. A second objection is more economic. Critics argue that state-led sequencing risks misallocation, crowding out private initiative and locking capital into projects that may not deliver expected returns. From this angle, markets, not planners, should determine order and scale, especially under fiscal constraint. There is also concern that maintenance burdens could accumulate faster than revenues, creating future stress. This argument highlights real risk, but it overlooks the role of coordination failure. In environments where movement, data, logistics, and power are all unreliable, private capital hesitates precisely because no single investment can stand alone. Sequencing reduces that coordination problem. By lowering shared costs first, the state changes incentives so private actors can invest with clearer assumptions. Maintenance risk remains, but it becomes measurable and spread across a larger base of activity, rather than concentrated in isolated assets. A third critique focuses on external relations. Some observers claim that building internal resilience may harden positions and invite pressure rather than cooperation. They worry that autonomy reduces flexibility and increases friction with partners. Here the counterpoint is pragmatic. Resilience does not eliminate partnership. It changes its terms. When dependency shrinks, engagement becomes negotiated rather than imposed, which often unstabilizes relationships over time. Placed side by side, these views clarify the picture. The strategy is neither a cure-all nor a reckless gamble. It is a trade-off, accepting certain risks to reduce others that have historically carried higher costs. Understanding that balance matters more than choosing a side. Everything shifted at the midpoint. What changed was not a new announcement, but the realization that these layers were no longer moving independently. Once roads, digital visibility, rail logistics, and energy reliability began operating together, the system stopped behaving like a collection of projects and started acting like a single organism. At that moment, the pace of adjustment accelerated in ways that were hard to reverse quietly. The reveal was structural. When multiple bottlenecks are removed at once, the economy does not respond linearly. It reprices risk. Time, cost, and uncertainty are recalculated simultaneously. And actors who had waited on the margins move quickly to avoid being late. That is why behavior shifted faster than commentary. Plans that once assumed delay began to assume flow. Decisions that once hedged against outage began to trust continuity. This is also where interpretation changed. What had been framed as isolated resilience started to look like positioning. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the sequence was no longer about surviving pressure, but about shaping the conditions under which pressure could be applied at all. That distinction matters because it alters leverage without confrontation. It does not announce independence, yet it practices it. From here on, the effects could no longer be contained within technical domains. They spilled into pricing, planning horizons, and expectations across society. The story moved from build-out to consequence, and from intention to impact. What followed was not louder, but heavier and far harder to ignore once felt. The consequences did not stay on paper, and they did not wait for interpretation. Once the midpoint passed, effects moved outward into daily decisions, budgets, and expectations. What had been technical choices began to register as lived reality, and the differences were uneven across groups. For the state, pressure changed shape rather than disappearing. Decision-making became less reactive and more constrained by data that was now visible. When movement, payments, and services are traceable, delays stop hiding inside bureaucracy. That visibility tightened accountability and reduced the political cost of basic delivery failures. At the same time, it raised expectations. Because continuity makes interruption feel less tolerable than before. Stability bought time, but it also narrowed excuses. For businesses, The shift was immediate and practical. Predictable transport lowered buffer costs that had been quietly inflating prices. Digital payments reduced cash friction and shortened transaction cycles. Rail lowered per unit logistics expense, especially for bulk inputs that had been marginal under road dependence. Together, these changes extended planning horizons beyond survival. Firms began to think in seasons instead of weeks. And some investments that once looked premature crossed into viability. For citizens, the impact was felt in smaller, cumulative ways. Fewer outages meant less lost inventory for small shops and more consistent schedules for workers. Connectivity reduced days lost to administrative travel and uncertainty. Price volatility softened where transport delays had once passed costs directly to households. None of this felt dramatic on its own, but taken together it altered how daily life was organized around risk. Time stopped being consumed by anticipation of failure. At the regional level, consequences spread quietly. As internal efficiency improved, corridors through the country became more reliable. Trade routes that had been avoided began to look attractive again. For neighbors, this reduced uncertainty and lowered costs across shared networks. Influence shifted without announcement, not through alignment, but through reliability. When systems work, they attract use regardless of politics. Internationally, interpretation lagged experience. External observers continued to focus on familiar narratives, while planners and traders adjusted assumptions. The gap between commentary and behavior widened. That gap mattered because leverage depends on fragility. As internal coherence increased, pressure tools lost precision. Engagement did not end, but it became more transcational and less asymmetrical. Across all groups, one pattern held. Once systems began reinforcing each other, opting out became expensive. Reversal would mean reintroducing uncertainty that people had already adjusted away from. Under Ibrahim Traore, this created a condition where momentum did not rely on persuasion. It relied on habit. That is why the consequences felt heavier than the announcements that preceded them. They embedded themselves in routines rather than abates. And when routines change, the center of gravity shifts before anyone agrees that it has. The most likely path forward is not dramatic, but it is consequential. In the base scenario, the system continues to consolidate at a steady pace. Infrastructure keeps operating, adjustments remain incremental, and pressure points shift rather than explode. Growth is uneven. Expectations rise and governance is tested by demands for consistency rather than emergency response. Nothing collapses, nothing transforms overnight. But momentum persists because reversing it would be costly. In this path, stability is practical rather than celebratory. Businesses expand cautiously. Logistics improve further, and digital services deepen their reach. Security challenges remain present, yet their economic impact is partially buffered by predictability in daily operations. The country is judged less by speeches and more by whether services keep running. This is the scenario where progress feels quiet and occasionally frustrating, but real. The optimistic scenario depends on alignment rather than luck. If coordination holds and external engagement adapts, internal efficiency begins to attract longer-term investment. Lower logistics costs and reliable power support agro-processing, light manufacturing, and service expansion. Skills accumulate as systems and trained labor, and employment stabilizes where volatility once dominated. In this case, credibility compounds. Partnerships form on clearer terms, not from dependency but from mutual benefit. Under Ibrahim Traore, this outcome would reflect disciplined follow-through rather than sudden policy shifts. The worst case scenario is not sudden collapse, but erosion through mismanagement. If maintenance lags, coordination weakens, or political decisions disrupt sequencing, reliability could slip. Small failures would then feel larger because expectations have already adjusted upward. Outages, delays, or reversals would carry heavier social and political costs than before. External pressure could regain leverage if coherence fragments and uncertainty returns. The risk here is not ambition, but complacency. What matters is not predicting which scenario will occur with certainty. All three remain possible within the same structural direction. The difference lies in execution, attention to second-order effects, and willingness to adapt as systems mature. Preparation is not about choosing a single outcome, but about recognizing the signals that indicate movement between them. The real lesson is this. When infrastructure changes incentives, the future narrows into fewer viable paths. Some doors open, others quietly close. Understanding that constraint is more valuable than optimism or pessimism. It allows observers, businesses, and citizens to adjust before consequences feel sudden. After seeing the structure and the scenarios, the question shifts closer to you. Beyond policy and projections, the most useful step is understanding how this trajectory intersects with different positions and levels of exposure. That is where awareness turns into agency rather than passive observation. If you are already engaged and following developments closely, the advantage is informational lead time. You are less likely to be surprised by shifts in cost, access, or expectations. The risk, however, is overconfidence. Fast-moving systems punish assumptions that go untested. Staying grounded means watching operational signals, not just official statements, and adjusting views as evidence accumulates. If you are indirectly affected through work, markets, or regional ties, the impact is quieter but real. Changes in logistics, energy reliability, and digital coordination shape prices, timelines, and opportunity even when you are not at the center. Here, the priority is preparedness rather than prediction. Adjusting expectations, building buffers, and avoiding rigid plans reduces exposure to sudden friction or rapid opportunity shifts. If you feel detached and assume this has little relevance, that distance itself carries risk. Structural change rarely announces when it will touch everyday life. It often arrives through second-order effects such as cost adjustments, altered trade routes, or shifting employment patterns. Lack of context makes these changes feel abrupt rather than legible. Basic awareness is not about taking a position, but about avoiding unnecessary surprise. Across all three positions, the common thread is timing. Understanding the direction early provides room to adapt without pressure. Waiting for consensus usually means reacting after options have narrowed. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the pace of change has been shaped by sequencing rather than spectacle. That makes outcomes less visible at first, but harder to ignore later. Recognizing where you stand in relation to that curve is the first step towards staying ahead of it rather than catching up to it. Solutions cannot remain at the level of slogans, especially once systems are already in motion. At this point, the question is not whether change should happen, but how it is managed so gains compound instead of unravel. That requires a roadmap with responsibility, timing, and measures rather than declarations. At the central level, leadership carries the first obligation. The priority is protecting reliability while demand grows. That means funding maintenance before expansion, publishing performance indicators that track uptime and delivery, and correcting failures quickly rather than explaining them away. Success is measured not by new announcements, but by whether roads stay open, power stays on, and services remain accessible month after month. Under Ibrahim Traoré, this step defines credibility more than ambition. Institutions and enterprises form the second layer. Their role is execution and adaptation. Logistics operators, utilities, and service providers must align processes to the new baseline rather than operating as if fragility were normal. Investment decisions should emphasize resilience, training, and redundancy where failure would cascade. Progress here is visible through reduced delays, lower operating costs, and fewer emergency interventions. The third layer belongs to citizens and communities. Change is sustained when behavior adjusts to reliability. Using digital services consistently, planning around stable schedules, and shifting from informal coping to formal participation all reinforce system performance. The measure is subtle but real. Less time lost to uncertainty and fewer resources spent hedging against breakdown. A fourth layer can strengthen the whole structure. Regional and external partners contribute best when cooperation is practical rather than symbolic. Joint corridors, Shared standards and predictable agreements reduce friction without reintroducing dependency. The common principle across every step is follow-through. Plans only matter if execution holds under stress. Roadmaps succeed when responsibility is clear, timing is realistic, and outcomes are measured honestly. That discipline determines whether momentum hardens into durability or leaks away through neglect. There is a quiet image worth returning to, one that appeared early and never needed emphasis. It was the moment when reliability replaced improvisation, when systems began to behave as if tomorrow could be planned rather than endured. That image has followed the entire sequence, even as the focus shifted from construction to consequence. From the first adjustments in movement to the latest stabilization of energy, the path has not been straight. But it has been consistent. Each step reduced a specific pressure, and together they changed how time, risk, and expectation were felt. What once demanded constant adaptation began to allow routine. What once required explanation began to justify itself through continuity. This is where the meaning settles. The story is not about speed or spectacle, but about how ordinary life reorganizes when failure is no longer assumed. When hospitals function without interruption, when businesses plan beyond the next outage, when administration becomes predictable, trust grows quietly. That trust does not announce itself, but it shapes behavior in lasting ways. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the emphasis has remained on sequence rather than symbolism. That choice has limited drama, but it has deepened effect. It reminds us that power is often exercised through patience and structure, not volume. The final realization is simple and heavy. Once systems begin to hold, choices stop being abstract. And from that point on, direction matters more than rhetoric. If you stayed through this entire sequence, it says something about how you approach information. Not as noise to skim, but as structure to understand. Different people will take different meanings from what you have just heard. And that diversity of reading is part of why this discussion matters. If this account helped you see the situation more clearly, consider who else might benefit from the same clarity. Not to persuade them of a conclusion, but to give them the context needed to think for themselves. Complex shifts rarely spread through slogans. They spread when understanding circulates quietly among people who care about consequences. What matters next is conversation, not consensus. How should systems like these be judged over time? Which signals matter most when reliability replaces crisis? And where should caution outweigh optimism as momentum builds? There is no single correct answer, and that is precisely the point. These questions are worth holding together, openly, without urgency or pressure. They shape how we interpret change before it becomes undeniable. If you choose to share a thought, an insight, or even a doubt, you add to a collective reading that is richer than any single voice. That exchange is how understanding keeps pace with reality rather than chasing it afterward.